I'm State Representative John Kavanagh, and this presentation is about Arizona's short-term rental law, a lesson in unintended negative consequences. Book 1, Genesis. In the beginning, there was no zoning, and municipalities were without form. And the people then said, "Let there be zoning," and it was good. But in 2016, the Arizona Legislature, enamored by the dual forces of the digital revolution and deregulation, exempted homeowners who wanted to rent out all or part of their homes for short-term rentals from local zoning laws and other regulations. And then, it was not so good. The 2016 short-term rental bill preempted local control, including residential zoning laws that generally prohibited short-term rentals in residential areas. It also greatly limited most local restrictions on usage, including local room occupancy limits, which opened the rental homes up for over-occupancy and party house and event venue abuses. It also limited nuisance enforcement. The bill had monumental support. The 2016 bill passed overwhelmingly in both the state Senate and the House and was enthusiastically signed into law by the governor. In fact, I was the lone no vote in the Senate. Note my red badge of courage. Was the legislature deceived by the army of lobbyists and supporters who rallied for the bill? Did we buy snake oil? Well, let's compare what we were told with what actually happened. Myth number 1, we were told this will allow empty nesters with an extra bedroom to earn a little extra cash renting a room to an exchange student from Sweden. You know you make me wanna take my heels up and throw my hands up and throw my head back and come on now, so I get to see you real. Well, at least they got the student part right. Myth number 2. They told us that the homeowners will be present in most cases to police the lodgers renting the room. But in reality, whole house rentals with absent owners are the norm. Few renters rent single rooms, and few owners want to have strangers in their homes while they are living there. Noisy parties, often in the backyards, go on long into the night. Myth number 3. People would not rent their homes for large events such as weddings, graduations, etc. These rentals were only for lodging. Not so. Myth number 4. Local police and code enforcers will effectively enforce the nuisance laws and code violations, they said. But in reality, local code enforcers generally only work weekdays, and most nuisance violations occur at night or on weekends. And the police are reluctant to enforce nuisance laws. In addition, it is difficult to legally serve the owner of the property or cite him or her for nuisances because they aren't there. And then came another unintended consequence. The short-term rentals are so profitable in high-demand tourist areas that they began displacing rentals for residents. In Sedona, 20% of the properties in the city proper are now short-term rentals, creating a housing crisis for local workers. And yet another unintended consequence. One condominium complex near downtown Scottsdale that was almost exclusively occupied by retired seniors now has about half of the units operating as short-term rentals. Young partying vacationers have taken over public areas and make a lot of noise, even late into the night. The character of the complex and the lifestyles of the retirees have been irreparably harmed. I told the head of the condominium complex, why don't you change your CCRs because you have an HOA and you can outlaw this activity. But she said, unfortunately, nearly half of the units are now short-term rentals, so they could never get the votes to change the rules. And still another unintended consequence. The inability to enforce occupancy limits sometimes resulted in gross over-occupancy and the clogging of neighborhood sewer lines. And one more unintended consequence. With 20% of Sedona's residential housing in the city proper now short-term rentals, their census population will be decreased, resulting in less population-based outside revenue, such as state shared income tax revenue. And let's not forget the litter, noise, and parking problems that come with poorly managed short-term rentals. My follow-up reform bill. After 3 years of worsening problems, I introduced legislation to help resolve some of them. But based upon the popularity of the original bill, I knew that, unfortunately, reforms had to be incremental, limited in scope, and surgically targeted at specific problems. In addition, stakeholders had to be included in the process, especially proponents of short-term rentals. Concepts had to be floated first and scaled back as needed. My 13 years in the legislature has taught me one important lesson. Overreach is the enemy that kills many bills. I collaborated with the Arizona League of Cities and Towns, the organization that represents and advocates for Arizona's municipalities, my wife, Linda Kavanagh, who was then mayor of our hometown, Fountain Hills, Arizona, and was dealing with some egregious cases, legislative staff, and stakeholders from the short-term rental industry and aggrieved homeowners. My original goals were to, 1, make nuisance prevention and enforcement easier by creating better procedures for identifying and communicating with the owners or their representatives. 2, create a deterrent fine structure that would result in license revocation whenever 3 violations with convictions had occurred within the previous 12 months. 3, ban commercial ownership and limit personal ownership to one's primary and secondary residences, to control the proliferation of units and provide a more level playing field for regular hotels. And 4, ban event venues completely. Goal number 1 was to make prevention and enforcement easier by better identification of and communication with owners or their representatives. This goal was met. The new law allows municipalities and counties to require the owners to provide contact information for themselves or their designee concerning the person who will respond to complaints of problems on the property. But the law was also a two-way street. The law also requires that the municipality or county notify the owner whenever nuisance citations or other citations or violations of law are written on the property. This is so the owners know what their renters are doing and hopefully will not re-rent to the bad actors. Goal number 2 was to create a deterrent fine structure that would result in license revocation whenever 3 violations with convictions had occurred within the previous 12 months. This goal was partially met. Instead of revocation after 3 convictions within 12 months, we created escalating fines without revocation. For the first violation, it's a $500 fine. On the second, $1,000, and on the third and all subsequent violations within the 12-month period, the fine is $1,500 or 50% of the gross monthly revenues for the unit, whichever is greater. If the local fine is less than those amounts, the difference is forwarded to the state general fund. It is hoped that these rather stiff escalating fines will be a deterrent to the bad actors. The third goal was to ban commercial ownership altogether and limit personal ownership to one's primary and secondary residences. Unfortunately, this goal had to be abandoned. After meeting with commercial companies, it became apparent that they tended to be highly responsible players who often rented to corporate clients, installed Wi-Fi trackers to prevent over-occupancy, and even installed decibel meters to monitor noise. They also hired persons to monitor the devices and then phone or respond to poorly behaving lodgers. And finally, the brick-and-mortar hotels showed little interest in the bill. The fourth goal was to ban event venues, and thankfully this goal was met. The new law specifies that vacation or short-term rentals are only for lodging and cannot be used for large events like weddings and graduation parties. The new law also contains protections for homeowners. It declares that for the purposes of calculating fines, multiple verified violations at the same incident will only count as one. Remember, the new law has escalating fines, $500 on the first, $1,000 on the second, and $1,500 or half of the month's gross receipts on the third violation. This rule declares that if on the first incidence an enforcement officer writes two violations, say noise and litter, that because it was at the same incident, it only counts as one strike in terms of escalating fines. Another protection requires the municipality to notify the homeowner of all violations cited on the property. And I mentioned this previously. This is so that the homeowner knows what's going on and can refuse to rent in the future to the bad actors. And finally, this law allows the judge on a first violation against the homeowner for violations on the property to waive the fine if the homeowner can demonstrate a good faith effort to control lodgers. This might be installing a decibel meter or Wi-Fi meter, having rules posted. It's a way for the good owners and renters to evade the fine on the first occasion. The new law also provides help for law enforcement and code enforcement personnel. It prohibits online lodging platforms like Airbnb or HomeAway from listing properties that do not have a sales tax license and requires the license number to be posted on the online ad. This is so enforcement personnel can make sure that all people offering homes for a short-term rental in their jurisdiction have a sales tax license and are paying those taxes. And if the number is not on the ad, the enforcement officer can call the online platform and say, take the ad down. The new law also authorizes local and county tax officials to access State Department of Revenue tax information to aid in law enforcement. In conclusion, many short-term rentals are not problematic, but some are really bad actors. But even the good actors can disrupt communities when there are too many of them. Government needs to decide where to strike the balance between a property owner's right to fair use of his or her property and the rights of surrounding property owners to set and maintain community standards. The effects of short-term rentals on existing brick-and-mortar hotels and on local housing availability and affordability also need to be considered, but not in isolation, but as part of other relevant factors, such as limits on apartment buildings and other housing factors. More fixes are needed and more fixes are coming. The modest reforms to the short-term rental law that I was able to enact this past session are not the end of the reform effort. At a recent League of Cities and Towns conference, Arizona Governor Doug Ducey acknowledged that the original law needs to be revisited yet again. And due to pushback from constituents and local elected officials, state legislators appear to be more open to changes. Some possible reforms. Assuming short-term rentals cannot be banned in residential areas, my preference, we need to make them as nearly invisible to neighbors as possible by reducing overall numbers and concentrations, banning off-site parking, prohibiting outdoor activities after 9 p.m. or 10 p.m., reinstating license revocation for three-time violators, limiting ownership to individuals or couples and only in their primary or secondary residences, allowing occupancy limits, and prohibiting more than one rental unit per building, and perhaps some other things not yet thought of. Is this the beginning of the end of the short-term rental monster?
What are they going to do with that thing, Dave?
Well, the Air Force is sending a globe master in. They're flying it to the Arctic.
Not dead, is it?
No, it's not. Just frozen. I don't think it can be killed, but at least we've got it stopped.
Yeah, as long as the Arctic stays cold.
Help me continue the fight for livable communities. Please go to electkavanagh.com/donate to make a contribution to my campaign, or mail donations to Kavanagh 2020, 16038 East Seminole Lane, Fountain Hills, Arizona 85268. Personal, family trust, or political action committee checks are allowed, but no corporate checks, please. Paid for by Kavanagh for State Representative 2020. Thank you.